Hi everybody, it's Amanda from LHL, and I want to talk to you today about 5 strategies for separating the meaning from your belongings. And this sounds a little cruel. I'm not actually I'm not suggesting that you need to not have meanings from your belongings, but a lot of times we have too many belongings that we feel are sentimental, and it's not really fair. So these are some approaches you can take to separate the less special things, make them not necessarily feel less sentimental, but detach yourself from that pull, that urge to hang on to these items. So some of the reasons why we would want to detach our sentimental feelings towards an item would be, one, if we have too many. Really the highly sentimental things should be able to be contained to, as Peter Walsh would say, my tabletop, if I were downsizing. Mine's small, right? So currently I have a chest, and if I were to unpack all of those things, it would probably take this whole table, because they're tightly packed in there, and the chest is probably this tall, maybe something like that. And so if we have lots and lots of things, it's not practical to deal with. So these are some of the strategies that you can use. The first one is give it time. And I know that sounds a little easy, and this is not the kind of time where you're putting it out of your mind. So when I was going through, a little backstory, I got into minimalism because I had a brain injury, and suddenly I found visual clutter to be significantly overwhelming. And so I went from being somebody who could I always wanted it out of sight, but I could manage it, and I could stuff things away and jigsaw it together in such a way that it stayed where I wanted it and it wasn't out of control. But with the brain injury, I suddenly couldn't manage as much things, and especially with paper. I had a lot of trouble with text, and I don't know what it is exactly. That's largely recovered, but I had a hard time retaining the information as I was reading it into my mind to be able to put it into context, to find meaning in those words. So I knew what the words meant individually, but trying to construct a paragraph, even a sentence, was kind of hard at times. So I did communicate with emails at work, and I managed to do okay throughout my prime time mentally. But then I'd get home and I'd be exhausted, and it would take 3 or 4 rereadings of even one sentence before I could get it to stick. So things radically changed for me at that time, and I found minimalism after there and started implementing these techniques. So it wasn't right away. It was probably 1.5 years later that I started into sentimental items. And at that time, I probably had around 4 file boxes, and then some stuffed things and other things like that I wasn't using, that you would consider to be sentimental as well. And so I tackled sentimental items. One of the strategies, getting back to the topic, the strategy of give it time for me was really, I come across something and I didn't know what it was about it that had a pull for me. So I pulled this out, I look at it, and I go, I don't know why, but I feel compelled to keep it. So because I didn't understand that, and it wasn't necessarily a positive, oh yeah, for sure, I love that, I want to keep it. It was just this sort of conflicting feeling. I set it on the table, literally here on the table, and walked by it for a week to sort of process the things that were coming to me as I would just glance and see it. And so a lot of times that helped me eventually let it go. I knew in the moment, because that conflicting feeling, you really don't want to keep things that make you feel bad. That's not the goal of sentimental items. And conflict suggests that there's something negative in with the positive, and that's why you're feeling like you need to keep it. And so putting it on the table and just seeing it, walking by it regularly, helped those feelings to come to the surface and allow me to process and deal with them. And then ultimately I was able to let them go. And so it really came down to recognizing, why am I feeling negatively about this thing? So that's what I mean when I say give it time. If you just lost a loved one, you might just need to give it out of sight time so that mentally you can get to a state where you're ready to tackle the things. So there are reasons to not prioritize decluttering the things before you deal with your own mental health. So I definitely want to preface that, that I wouldn't tackle any of these until you've dealt with the mental health. And not to say that it'll be completely done with, right? You're always going to have a little something. But there will come a time where you feel strong enough to deal with them. So even with me and the brain injury, right away, I definitely couldn't deal with it. So it took some time. I had to go very slowly. I didn't touch Sentimental until I'd gone through many other categories. So that's tip number 1, give it time. And tip number 2 is to give it perspective. That also seems a little overly simple, I'm sure. But the main thing is we will hold on to things that in our past meant a certain something. Or it means a certain something for our future. So we'll hold on to something that was good for us that we think we would want for our grandkids. That's where both the past and the future are involved. Usually the future is not involved in sentimental things, except the fact that you have to let go of an idea of who you thought you were. And that's called fantasy clutter. So that's a different thing. We're not talking about that. But there might be something you held onto from your past, from your parents' past, from your grandparents' past, that you, in your mind, are thinking about how you'd use it in the future, or how your family might use it in the future. And that's the kind of thing we want to, okay, let's take it for what it is today. What is my life today? Who could possibly use it today? So in the blog, I use an example of a trombone. Let's just say that your grandfather played a trombone in a military touring band and loved it. It was a great part of his life. And you'd never learned to play trombone and didn't have any interest in it. But you held on to it. Now you have this awkward thing. I don't know if anybody's seen a trombone case before, but it does not stack amongst other things well. So it's got a big bell at the bottom, and then comes in, and it's narrow, and it's very long, like 4 feet long. So they fold the trombone up. It doesn't really fold. Take the slide off, put it side by side. And so it's half the length of a real trombone is the case. Super awkward. It's not a practical thing to expect yourself to continue to carry it forever when you don't use it. It's not a practical thing to expect a loved one to take it on in some imaginary hopes that a grandkid down the line is going to use this item. So let's just take for a second and pretend you don't use it, you have this trombone, and then you get rid of it. And down the line, your grandson loves trombone and starts playing trombone. He even has to buy his own trombone because you don't have this one anymore. But you know what you do still have? The stories and the love that your grandfather had for trombone. So it is not about his trombone, it's about what playing the trombone meant to him. I feel like I'm saying trombone a lot. Probably am. You have those memories of your grandfathers that you can now share with your grandson, regardless of the actual trombone. You let it go, that's fine. It's not that big a deal that he's not playing that same instrument. But you can share that story and all of the backstory for your grandfather and everything he did with trombone, especially if you have pictures that you can show, programs you can share, anything like that. So that's what I mean by give it perspective. Let's put it into context of today. And if you actually have a grandson that's already playing trombone, great time to give it to him and tell him the story now. However, there's a good chance he still doesn't want two trombones, and he may not favor his grandfather's trombone over his. It could happen, but you've offered it, and that's realistic, and you can still let this go and still share the stories with your grandson and anybody else who is interested. So this is giving it perspective. We want to step back and not make up millions of imaginary versions of the future. We also need to recognize that this isn't something that we personally value. Not that we don't value our grandfather's experience with his trombone. We don't value the trombone itself. We're not playing it. It's not a huge part of our life. It's just collecting dust. The third strategy is to weigh its true value. So in any business, you have what is called an inventory holding cost. And I know this sounds not applicable to the home, but the truth is it is, especially when we've overstuffed every room. So an inventory holding cost is something that you think will be valuable down the line, or something you are currently using. So even a pantry qualifies here, right? We will eat this in the future, but in the meantime, how long are we holding it? So for how much area it takes up and how long we're holding it versus how we're using it, the cost of it is your inventory holding cost. So the longer you hold this item unused, the more costly it is. So we want to keep that in mind. Even though we're willing to hold our pantry items because that's going to be a meal in a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month. Some people are crazy in their way out there, but for most people, in a month or 3, it's going to be consumed. And that cost of the space is usually fairly small, and it's worth it to us. So you look at this trombone we used as an example before, and it went through your grandfather's lifetime. Theoretically, going to your grandchild's lifetime, this could be a span of, what do we want to say, like possibly 50 years. It could be 70 years we're holding on to this across the whole family, and it wasn't used since the time your grandfather stopped the military band at the age of 20 something. And now your grandson at the age of maybe 12 picks it up. So that's a lot of time we've been holding on to an object that was probably only worth a couple $100. I don't even know what the most expensive trombone is, but it's not likely it was the most expensive trombone. And while they do hold that value decently, you've wasted it all in between. So it ate away the cost of that. So that's one of the value systems that we use. The other is valuing the sentiment itself. So if you had a picture of your grandfather in this band versus the trombone, the value of these two sentimental items compared to each other, they're remembering the same thing. The value of the picture is much better because it shows your grandfather and the trombone, along with everybody else that was there with him at the time, in the time period that the memory happened, right? So that is a much better sentimental value item than the trombone is. So letting the trombone go in favor of the picture would be very wise. Those are two ways that you can look at the actual cost of items. The fourth strategy is to see the trees in the forest, right? So you hear the term of you can't see the trees through the forest or the forest through the trees. That in looking at either the big perspective or the small perspective, you miss the other. So in this case, that would be applied to categories of things. Like, let's say you unpacked your grandmother's kitchen. You packed all of her kitchen items into a bin and you brought it home thinking all of them are equally special because my grandmother loved to cook. And we spent so much time cooking with her. But the truth is, once you open that container and you start pulling out individual items, there will be items that you never saw her use. You never used with her. Maybe they're brand new, or maybe they were so old she'd stopped using them but stuffed them away in her kitchen. So these are not all equal value. And you can test this theory out by looking at china sets, for instance. This is something that is going by the wayside. But even if you compare each piece within a china set, you'll find that saucers or sugar bowls, that type of thing, end up being more valuable. They sell for higher cost because people would break them more easily, or they never bought them in the first place. They were an addition piece. And so plates tend to be pretty cheap. You can find somebody that sold off a set of 3 because they broke every other plate, but there were so many plates produced that literally all of these pieces will have different values, and different values compared to their original sale value. So this is reality, that all pieces in a set are not equal. All pieces within a collection are not equal. So definitely, when you have too much, look through it and find 1 or 2 high sentiment pieces, just like the picture was versus the trombone. Strategy number 5 is to give up the green. So this has 2 parts to it. One is the sunk cost fallacy. So it's the idea that because we put money into it in the past, it is retaining or more valuable than if we were to just come across it in a store today. So our brains connect to the thing because we've had it, and therefore add artificial value to the item. And when we go to sell it, then we're really disappointed because nobody else sees that value. It was intrinsic to us. And it's unfortunately alive and well in all of your belongings. And it doesn't mean you should get rid of all of your belongings, of course, but keep in mind that the item didn't actually hold the value that you think it does in your mind. The second piece is a lot of people really want to get rid of things in the best way. And sometimes that means for the environment, sometimes that means making sure somebody else, the exact right person, will get this and love it. And you just can't guarantee that. Holding on to that hope will keep you from letting things go. And we would like to find people that would use it, but you could hold that item for another 2 years in hopes to find the right person. And even somebody who appears to be the right person in the moment may not be the right person in the end. So we really need to let go of that idealism of how we're dealing with especially sentimental items, because in reality there are some places that will take old photographs. There are some places that are going to be interested in old instruments. They can certainly refab those. And yeah, you might be able to find good enough places, but to be able to find the right place for everything, like I had a trophy that was glass and it's etched glass. They can't do anything with that. They can't smooth it off again and then re-etch it for somebody else. It doesn't work like that. However, if you have a trophy with a nameplate, they can just rip the nameplate off, put another one on, and sell it. So these are different problems, but there will be some that there is no good solution for except to throw it away. And I encourage you to go ahead and do that if you need to. Alright, I hope you find these 5 tips helpful, and feel free to check out any of my other links. I'll have some videos show up here somewhere. Wherever there's room, we will find some videos to share for you. And feel free to check out the blog. It'll be linked below. I have the same example, but also some additional perspective in each of those areas. Thanks for hanging with me today. Goodbye.